All right, so just tell me when to begin and I'll go. Hello?
John, your time will begin when you begin speaking.
All right, so I want to go over, I was taking notes about his points, and he made four main points, right? And I'm going to get into definitions, but first I want to quickly answer these points. So first he mentioned the energies of created order. So he says that if the energies enter into time and space, then the energies will automatically be created. But this is a complete misunderstanding of what temporality and time mean, right? Because time is a noun and then temporality is an adjective, and temporality, the adjective temporality describes time, right? And it speaks about within a realm, right? So it speaks about so essentially what it speaks about, when we speak of creating, right? Creating means caused by one's actions. When it is caused by one's temporal actions as bounded within temporality, then that thing becomes absolutely bound by temporality and therefore created, right? But this is not applicable to the energies of God, as in the energies that pertain to creation, because St. Basil says in Homily 1 of Hexameron, he says that God perfected his works on the sixth day, right? And St. Gregory Palamas, he explicates on this, and he speaks about this, and he's quoting St. John of Damascus in Book 3 on the Orthodox Faith, and he speaks about the potential of these energies of created order, right? Like, for example, jealousy is an energy of created order, right? Because the jealousy is an effectuation of possessiveness, and God is possessive over that which he loves. And we see in Deuteronomy 6:15 where God says to Israel, whom he loves, that I, your God, am a jealous God. Now we know from divine revelation that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit eternally love each other. Therefore, this energy of love, right, is a natural energy. It is an eternal energy because it pertains to God for all creation. But the potential of jealousy, because love is possessive, the potential for that energy of created order lies within this natural energy, and it is effectuated when it pertains to creation, right? Because God is possessive over his creation. It is perfected in creation. And this is why Saint John of Damascus, when speaking of the energies of created order, he speaks about how an operation is a perfection of potentia, right? So this isn't even an argument, because this would be presupposing that all of the energies are natural energies. No, Saint Gregory Palamas, whom I'm assuming you haven't read, makes this distinguishment between natural energies and energies of created order in triads 3. The second part he mentioned is division of parts. I went over this in my opening statement. He just said that, oh, it does lead to division, it does lead to parts. No, I was very clear that the categorization of whole and parts is only applicable to that which is substance, right? And because the energies aren't substances, therefore that categorization is not applicable to them. In fact, the Holy Church Fathers, they actually turn this around and refute your doctrine on this, because Saint Cyril of Alexandria says in Thesaurus 31 that if what is of God, and he's referring to the energies of God, and this is in Thesaurus 9, Thesaurus 17, and Thesaurus 18, right? He says that if what is of God is identical to his essence, then God for us would be composed of many essences. St. Basil in letter 38, chapter 1, he uses essence and substance interchangeably. And then St. Gregory Nazianzus, he argues the same exact thing against those who believe in absolute divine simplicity, right? Just like the Eunomians, right? Which we can get into, saying that when we're speaking about that which is around God, right? Which we'll get into St. Gregory of Nyssa, if we're talking about that which is around God and we're saying this is identical to his essence, then God would be composed of many substances. God would be composite. So according to the Church Fathers, your position leads to division and composition, not ours. And another thing I would like to mention is St. Gregory of Nyssa, right? St. Gregory of Nyssa, he speaks about the conceptual distinction in on the Holy Trinity, right? More specifically, page 21. But in page 22, when he speaks about this distinction, he's speaking about it being conceptual insofar as much as what we conceptualize is real. When you walk into your room, you conceptualize your bed. Your bed isn't just a mere conceptualization. It's not reducible to this. But when you conceptualize your bed, it is really there, right? Hence, St. Gregory of Nyssa says in paragraph 6 of on Not Three Gods, he says that we know God by his surroundings, right? And he explicates on this and affirms the real distinction. Now, concerning essence and energy not being identical, again, my soul is not identical to my body. See, Canadian Catholic isn't going to argue that there's division in my person. So this isn't really an argument. I answered this in my opening statement. And now I'm going to define energy, right? And energy is a property or characteristic, right? So when we're speaking about the energies, right, we're speaking about what God, essentially, what God is, not in the sense of his essence, because his essence is his whatness, but 1 John 4:8 is very clear that God is love, right? Because the energies are God himself in his operation. So we believe that the energies are fully God. So when you, in your opening statement, you say that we don't believe that, no, we do believe that, and we can argue further on this. And we just define energies as properties, characteristics, etc. And I'll concede the rest of my time because it's very clear from Saint Maximus that the energies are properties, are characteristics, but they're not parts because they're not substances. Therefore, that categorization is not applicable to them.
Okay. Thank you, John, for the rebuttal period. Canadian Catholic, your 8-minute rebuttal period will begin when you begin speaking.
Yeah, so I don't know where to start because I think I would disagree with every single one of those points that were intelligible, and the rest I don't know if they were. So first of all, the definition of energies, this is important. He defines them as properties. So energies are properties and they're equivalent to God. Now, first of all, this disagrees with the fundamental view that God has no properties, which comes from, I mean, the Eastern Orthodox canon. I mean, this view that God has no properties is found as early as you go. It can be found very explicitly, actually, in Dionysius, Pseudo Dionysius. The Areopagite very clearly makes it clear that God has no properties. But fine, maybe God has properties, which means that there are universals in God, I guess. That's one way to understand it, which would be heretical. The other way to understand it is, of course, to have predicables. Properties are not instantiations. God doesn't instantiate anything, but rather God has predicables. That's good and fine, but when we make these predicables identical to God, then that's absolute divine simplicity. This is a dilemma that, of course, arises from calling energies properties of God while saying they're equivalent to God. Either God exemplifies those properties and also is identical to them, which again violates the view that God has no properties, because nothing universal can be in God. Or the second problem that arises from this is that they're predicables, but if they're identical to God, then there can be no distinction between them and God. No real distinction, because then it wouldn't be identical, and thus we're going back to absolute divine simplicity. John made a fatal mistake saying that soul and body do not mean that we have soul and, like humans have soul and body, but are united. This is somehow an analogy of essence energy distinction. This is a fatal mistake because anybody with minimal knowledge of Aristotle knows that soul and body are matter-form composites. They're the clearest example of a composite. So this is a horrible, horrible objection. Secondly, Mr. John stated that energies are not a substance. And this is interesting because if the energies are properties, then they are formal causes, which means that they are formal causes after all, right? Again, unless John means properties in the sense of predicables and not those things that are instantiated, and then if those predicables are simply identical to God, then there is no distinction between that and absolute divine simplicity. Now, the question, of course, is: do energies have any kind of a cause, and what is it that distinguishes them between energies and the essence of God? Because the essence of God has none of the four causes. It doesn't have a formal cause. It doesn't have a final cause, anything, as we all know. And presumably, if the same can be said of energies, then what is it in virtue of which they're distinguished, right? That's the point that we're making. And of course, none of this has gotten a response. Fourthly, of course, no response was made to the view of how something that is essentially atemporal can be temporal, right? Anything that is temporal exists in a way in which it changes. So time is the measure of change. That which is atemporal is incapable of changing. That's the whole point of being atemporal. Not just doesn't change, but is incapable of changing. How can something that's incapable of changing change? That is a contradiction in terms. This has been a problem I've been raising against the energy, against the essence energy distinction for a long time, and I've gotten no response to this whatsoever. So to summarize, after all, when John maintains that energies are not a substance, he presumably here means that they have none of the four causes. They don't have a formal cause, so on and so forth, in which case either they're not distinct from God or they are nothing, pretty much. Secondly, soul body is a composite. That's a matter-form composite. He was wrong. God has no properties. Energies being properties of God is very, very problematic because, again, if they are properties of God, and he also wants to maintain that God is identical to his properties, which again sounds a lot like divine simplicity, again, without the properties. But he's collapsing into two problems here. If properties is understood as exemplifiables or instantiables, as modern philosophers like to say, then this violates the key idea in Christian orthodoxy that there is no such thing in God. God is essentially not something that has instantiables. There is no such thing as a property in God that God instantiates. And of course, the other way to understand this is predicables. But then God is identical to all of his predicables, which is just divine simplicity, absolute divine simplicity, or whatever you want to call it. So to sum it up, I find John's case to be incoherent, and it responds to none of the problems that have been raised. It, in fact, makes things even less clear than they are. And I mean, I don't know what else to say.
All right, so I guess I'll get into these points in the open discussion, because now it's cross-examination, and I haven't really, because I wanted to focus on my position for my opening statement. I didn't hear much on you for your position, but now that we're doing cross-examinations, I'm going to question you on your position. So I have a question. Are the relations of Greg Pill, are you timing the cross-examination?
Yes, continue.
All right, so I have a question. So are the relations of oppositions, are they identical to the divine essence?
Sorry, you have to repeat that. I don't understand the question.
Are the relation of oppositions that Thomas Aquinas says in question 36 of the Summa distinguishes the hypostases, are they identical to the essence? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, great. When you say that love is identical to the essence and wisdom is identical to the essence, you would agree that you're saying wisdom and love are identical to each other, correct? In God.
No, we would say that God's love and God's wisdom are identical to each other, yes.
Yes, okay. So why can't you say that procession and begetting are identical to each other?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Why? You said that the relation of opposition, begetting, and spiration, you said that they're identical to the essence. Now, you also said that love and wisdom are identical to the essence. Therefore, on that, you say that they're identical to each other. So why can't you say that spiration and begetting are identical to each other?
Okay, so first of all, so two responses here. First of all, the distinction that exists between God's wisdom and God's love is a distinction of conception. The distinction between relations is a relational distinction. That's the first point to make. Secondly, the existence of identity of any kind for us is a logical concept. There is no identity in the real world out there, right? Identity is something that we logically predicate of things. So I guess those two responses would suffice.
Okay, but you didn't answer the question. How is begetting not identical to spiration? You talked about wisdom and love, which you admitted 2 minutes ago are identical to each other. So why
There's a
can't...
relevant difference. Because there's a relevant difference. Because one is a conceptual distinction and the other is a relational distinction.
Okay, great. And what's a relational distinction?
I mean, a distinction that obtains in virtue of a relational difference.
Okay, what are you defining as distinction?
I'm not using a special term. It can be found in the dictionary.
Well, here's the thing, right? When you say distinction, you're talking about a difference. Now, obviously, when a father begets a son, they're really different from one another, and the relation of opposition that they share are really different, right? So are you admitting a real distinction in God, even though you're identifying that real distinction with the essence of God? It seems like a contradiction.
So, for a real distinction to obtain, there must be something that is really grounded between one relation and the other, and nothing like that can exist in the distinction between the word and the principle, the father. Nothing like that can exist. So that can't be a real distinction.
Okay, so there isn't a real distinction between the father and son. GG.
No, that doesn't follow, right? The real distinction between the father and the son doesn't exist per. So the real distinction doesn't exist between the father and the son qua essence. So we would agree there is no real distinction between the father and the son.
Okay, so you are a modalist, because that's what the modalists say. They say, one second. This is my time to question you. The modalists, they say that, okay, yeah, you can. One second. It's my time to speak.
That's not a question.
Hold on. All right. Stop.
Please, you're not.
Please stop. Please refrain from telling the other person their position, and only phrase your questions in the form of questions, John.
Yep.
1 second, if you allow me to finish, what I was saying is that the modalists, they will say that there is a conceptual distinction.
It's not a question.
You're not letting me finish. It's going to be
a question. I don't want to.
DC, please stop. John, please form your question in the form of a question.
Maybe if you'd let me finish my sentence, you'll see that this is a form of the question.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Great. So the modalists, they say that there's a conceptual distinction between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? Yet they're not really distinct. They're the same person, right? That's what identification means. So how is your position any different from modalism?
Yeah. So the modalist view. So first of all, we don't believe that the distinction between the persons of the Trinity is merely conceptual; it's relational. Secondly, the distinction is that modalist view is that the distinction obtains in the eye of the observer. So the relational distinction that exists between the Father and the Son is not a relational distinction as much as it is a distinction of appearance. So the Father and the Son appear differently to the observer while they are the same. That's the modalist view. Our view is that in God there's a relational distinction. So that's the difference between a modalist and a Christian.
Yeah, but that's just with extra steps because the relational distinction you would admit is not a real distinction.
Not a
So how do you
question.
reconcile that? If you let me finish, I said how do you reconcile that?
There's
You're not
nothing
letting
to
me speak.
reconcile. There's nothing to reconcile. There is no real distinctions in God. That's not modalism because modalists maintain that there is no distinction of any kind within the persons
And what do you
themselves.
define as a real distinction?
Please refrain from over talking one another.
You have to refrain from over talking me. Yeah, so a distinction, the modalist view is that there's a distinction, there's no distinction in the Father and the Son. The distinction is how the Father and the Son appear. Our view is that there is a distinction between the Father and the Son, but that distinction is relational and not real. That's the point.
Okay, great. So what are you defining as a relational and what are you defining as a real distinction? Because distinction in my head just means difference.
Yeah, so distinctions can come in many forms, right? So distinction can be understood as difference, but distinction can be made purely. So a real distinction would be a distinction that's grounded really in the two sides that are distinct. And the classical example is the observer observed relation. So if I'm observing somebody, I am really related to that someone because, like, if I stop observing, I'm no longer observing, so on and so forth. But the one who is observed is only not really related to me. The relation is not real because nothing in them makes them observed other than me observing them, so on and so forth. So our view when it comes to God is that there's a distinction that obtains purely because of relational differences. So the difference can only exist because logically relations are opposed to each other, but there's nothing else other than these relational distinctions that would distinguish the Father and the Son because they are the same qua essence. But that relational distinction exists in God. And that's what the modalists deny. Modalists say that distinctions that exist of any kind are located outside of God. They're located in how he appears. And that's, of course, the difference between us and the modalist.
Okay, great. So I have a question. So me and you, right? We're both human beings. We're both technically identical to human nature. Are we really distinct?
Yeah, so we're not identical to the human nature. Unless by human nature you mean the human nature in the sense that medievals understood it, in which case we wouldn't both be identical because I would be identical to my human nature, you'd be identical to yours. The other way to understand it is that we're both identical to humanness, which is wrong. We're not identical to humanness because humanness is distinct from us. Humanness is a universal. We're not universals, we're particulars. So that's wrong.
No, okay. Well, I'll explain what I meant in my discussion. But okay, so the relational distinction. There's still differences instantiated in the relational distinction, right?
So there's no instantiations in God of any kind.
Okay, and what are you defining as instantiation?
15 seconds remaining.
Properties being exemplified.
Okay, properties being exemplified. So you don't believe that there's any hypostatic property distinguishment?
No properties can exist in God.
Okay, great. Then that just refutes the relation of opposition.
You're not supposed to make arguments.
Was that a question, sir?
Sorry, I assumed the time was over. I was about to say that talk
Thank
about how
you.
the relation of. All right, sure.
Thank you for the questions. The cross examination will now revert. I'll pause for a moment in order for the participants to get any questions aligned on their notes, and shortly the time will begin when Canadian Catholic begins.
Right.
Yeah, I'm ready. Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm ready.
Okay, you said that energies are properties of God. Do you still maintain this?
Yes, energies are properties, characteristics, attributes. Yes.
Do you deny that God has no properties?
Do I believe that God has no properties?
Or do you deny the view that God has no properties?
No, God has properties.
it. Do you believe there's a multiplicity of properties in God?
Yes, just as Saint Dionysius says on the Divine Names, chapter 2, that there's a multiplicity in God without division.
Okay. So do you believe that there are opposing properties in God?
What are you defining as opposing properties?
Properties
I just want to understand your terminology.
properties that cannot be reconciled, like love and hate.
Well, we don't. Well, what we would say is that the energies indwell one another. So we would be speaking about, because hate pertains to creation, so it would depend on the distinguishment you're making.
Do you believe there are opposing properties in God?
I wouldn't say that there's any contradicting properties in God. No,
So all properties God have do not contradict each other?
they don't contradict each other because God is perfect.
Okay. Are properties of God identical to God?
Insofar as much as they indwell one another, yes, but not in strict identification. No.
Okay, so they're not identical to God.
Yeah, they're not identical. Well, they're not identical to his essence. The energies are still fully God.
Is there anything other than essence that's God?
Yes, there's the hypostases and the energies. Saint Gregory Palamas says that we pertain through realities to God, essence, energy, and divine hypostases.
Okay, so there is essence of God, which is fully God, and then there is hypostasis, which is also fully God, and there is energies that are fully God, right?
Yes.
Are energies identical to hypostases?
No.
Are hypostases identical to essence?
No.
So there is three things that are not identical to each other but are fully God.
Yes, in their own distinctive respects. For example, I am fully my soul in respect to my soul, and I'm fully my body in respect to my body. They're undivided, yet this doesn't who made that noise? But this doesn't institute a division within me.
So what distinguishes an essence from an energy?
The fact that the essence of God is God as he is in his superessential transcendency and interbeing, whereas the energies of God are how God acts within creation and the attributes of God.
What is it in virtue of which energies and essence are identical?
Well, they're not identical in strict identification. The only way we can say this is that the essence fully subsists in that which proceeds from it, i.e. the energies, but they're really distinct.
Okay, do you believe that there's a distinction that exists in God?
Yes, I believe that there are multiple real distinctions in God, yes.
So what accounts for those distinctions?
The fact that divine revelation reveals them and that basis.
I'm not asking how we know those. I'm asking what accounts for those, because it's not God that's ultimate. So what is it that is responsible for these distinctions?
What do you mean? What do you put? Can you just describe that a little bit? I just want to understand your point.
So God isn't ultimate, from what I understand, because God is not that which instantiates these divisions. They exist without the control of God, right?
Well, that's presupposing divisions because you just said it yourself that there's
You said
instantiations in
there's
these
multiple
divisions.
You said there's multiple distinctions in God. Am I wrong?
Yes, but distinctions is not divisions. Division. One second. Division means this. One second.
No,
Division.
this is my time. No,
You asked me a question. You asked me a
no,
question.
I didn't ask you the question.
You asked me. You asked
No,
me.
I
Did you
didn't
mean
ask you
that
that
there were
question.
distinctions in God?
Please, John, hold on, John. Please allow Canadian Catholic to answer your question. And for if this was unclear, the purpose of this debate, the person asking the question has free reign to cut off or stop the person's response if they feel that that is not sufficiently responding to the question being asked.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
What accounts for the distinctions in God?
Well, what are you defining as that? I have to understand what you mean by that because that's a very vague term.
Yeah. So what is it that makes it so that there is a distinction in God? Is that a brute fact?
Oh yeah, very simple. God creating the world is not the same thing as God being eternal. Otherwise, creation would be eternal.
That doesn't answer my question. You're saying that
It does.
No, it doesn't. You're saying that energies and essence are fully God, and yet they're distinct. And I'm asking
Yes.
you, what is God? Is God different? If there is distinctions in God, and both of them are fully God, is God Himself something different from His essence?
Is God Himself? Well, we have to look into distinctive respects. So God is God. God as He is in His energies is really distinct from God as He is in His essence. So we have to explicate on that in order to understand this.
Is God a different? Is God a being?
Being is an energy of the essence because being is synonymous with existence. Existence is.
Okay, fine.
One second. I'm not done answering your question.
It's irrelevant. I don't want you to waste my time. What is God?
God is essence, energy, and divine hypostases.
Okay, so God is the sum of these three?
God is not the sum of these three because the categorization of whole and parts is only applicable to the essence. But even St. Dionysius says that the essence transcends those logical categories in page 129, chapter 13 of On the Divine Names.
So you're saying that God is essence, hypostasis, and energy, but these don't make him up. He just is those three.
They don't make them up because they're not because hypostases and
I
energies.
don't need you to explain why. I want to ask you. Okay, to get clear. So is God distinct from his essence?
God as he is in his energies is distinct as God as he is in his supercentral transcendency and interbeing, i.e., his essence. Yes.
Okay, fine. Is God essentially changeless?
In his essence, yes, but he changes in his energies, i.e., the energies that pertain to creation.
How is it not a contradiction for God to both change and not change?
Very simple, because that's a big reason why we have the essence energy distinction. Hence, we make the distinguishment between God as he is in his supercentral transcendency and interbeing, and God in his operations, moving and pulsing into creation. So God changes in his energies insofar as much as the energies of created order. That's why we have this distinction, which you don't maintain.
Okay, look, I'm gonna ask again. So can God be changeless at one point and be also changing at another point?
God is change. One second. God is immutable and changeless in his essence, but he changes in his energies that pertain to creation. Your question is presupposing ADS.
Well, I guess I don't understand, but that's fine. Okay, so you're saying that energies are not a substance?
Energies are not substances, no.
So how can a property have no substance?
How can a property have no substance? Because substance, by definition, is actually something with properties. And according to Osberg's books on real essentialism, page 156 to 157, no property that flows from one's essence is a part of the essence. Therefore, energies are not property. Therefore, energies are not substances.
Do energies have a material cause?
What do you mean? What do you mean by material cause?
Aristotle's material cause, something that makes them up by matter.
No, the energies are not composed of matter.
Okay, do energies have a formal cause?
Oh, or what are you defining as formal cause first?
Well, Aristotle's formal cause. I'm not defining it any special way.
Well, can you just tell me? Can you explicate on that? I just want to understand your position because there's different readings.
They have a-
St. Maximus is clear on this.
They have a form.
On theology.
No, this is my time to talk. Do they have a form?
They have a form, a physical form? No.
No, like
They
form.
have a manifestation, but they don't have a physical form, as in a human body.
Do they have a form in the sense of an essence? Do they have an essence?
Jermaine.
Hello?
Well,
All right. Can you repeat the question?
how many seconds?
Go ahead. Last question.
Yeah, just let him ask the last question.
So, do energies have any kind of a cause?
The energies that pertain to creation are actualized, so you can say a cause insofar as much as that.
All right, I guess that's it.
Well, thank you so much to both of you guys. I think this will conclude the formal portion of this debate, and we will now move into the open discussion period. So I would like to begin this period by asking questions that I heard from this previous period. And in the meantime, please feel free to DM me. I don't know if there's a different way to unmute people. So if unless another mod can tell me, you guys feel free to DM me any questions that you would like to be asked of the participants. My first question that I'd like to ask while we're waiting is, John, when you said that God's, I believe, essence transcends these logical categories, does that make God then incoherent?
No, that doesn't, because transcendency refers to the mode in which you exist, and when we apply logical categories, we apply them to in most contextualizations we apply them to finite elements. But because we know from difficulty, chapter 5 of St. Maximus the Confessor, that the essence of God is even beyond infinity, therefore these finite logical categorizations are not applicable to that which transcends the mode of existence.
Understood. Thank you. Canadian Catholic on absolute divine simplicity. Can you further explicate your view of the difference between what you call these, I believe the terminology you used was real distinctives versus not real distinctives?
Yeah, so distinction comes in many forms. Distinction can be, as we see, conceptual, it can be relational, it can be real. Okay, so to use a simple example, conceptual distinctions are distinctions that are mainly exist as concepts. Okay, and there are distinctions that exist in concepts. For example, there's a distinction between a morning star and the evening star, right? These refer to the same object, right? But they can pick out two different properties, perhaps. They can pick out two different understandings, but they refer to the same thing. Now, the real distinction is a distinction, as I explained, that has a ground. That has a ground, I guess, in both of those things that are distinct. And again, the example that is used is between the observer and the observed. Being related really to something, to be really related to something, something about you, something about something else to change would have to affect you, right? Or vice versa. That's the real relation. So when we say that in God there is, when we're talking about God is not, for example, really related to the universe, we're saying that nothing that happens in the universe has anything to do with God. The universe could burn up and explode and God would be immutable, nothing would change in God. Whereas the other way around, this is counter-possible, but assuming if God were to, for example, explode or decide something, so on and so forth, something would change about the universe, meaning that the universe is really related to God, God isn't really related to the universe. Now, when it comes to the Trinity, the distinction isn't real in the sense that Father and the Son are identical. They're referring to the same being. There is the same being that has the same knowledge, same will, so on and so forth, right? Same thought, one thought, actually. The distinction arises purely on relational basis. When God knows himself, there is necessarily a distinction between the knower and the known. This distinction arises from the very fact of knowing, God knowing himself. Right? So whatever is known is what we call the word. And that's the opposition of relation. That's the relational distinction.
Thank you. That's
Yeah,
very
oh,
helpful. Another,
very
sorry.
quickly, since this is open very quickly, since this is open discussion, can I say something on that?
Sure.
Yeah, so very quickly, I'd like to say this, right? So since he brought up the example of a celestial sphere, right? I'd like to quote Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. So Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, when he speaks about the real distinctions in God, he speaks about how there are clear distinctions in God in chapter 2 of On the Divine Names. And the analogy he uses for this is that if you walk into your room, you have multiple lamps, right? So and those are all really distinct lights. They're all really different and they're all really distinct, yet they're indivisible because they interpenetrate one another. And I can take this analogy and say, okay, well, the light of the sun is really distinct from the light of the moon, but we know that moonlight is a reflection of sunlight, but the light that illuminates from the moon is really distinct from the light of the sun, yet they're indivisible from one another, therefore showing that there can be a real distinction without entailing a division, because Saint Dionysius the Areopagite says in chapter 2 of On the Divine Names that although these are clearly distinct, there is unity in distinction and distinction in unity.
Very good. Thank you. So, a question for John. Please first define part, and then the follow-up question is, how is an uncreated energy not a part?
Oh, yeah, very simple. So a part is a fraction of something, i.e. something that is not a whole, right? But in order for something to not be a whole, right, that would presuppose a dichotomy that it is either a whole or a part, which is only applicable to substances. And because energies are not substances, that categorization is not applicable to them. And the reason why they're not parts is because according to Osberg's books called Real Essentialism, this is in page 156 to 157, he speaks about every property that flows from one essence is not a part of that essence, yet they're really distinct from one another, right? Without contradicting unity, nor entailing a division.
Got it. Understood. The next question comes from a member of the server. The question is for Canadian Catholic. If God's knowledge is identical with power, and his power... this question is not very intelligible. If God's knowledge is identical with power and his power, and if God knows himself, i.e. his knowledge relates to his essence, then God's power, which is his ability to actualize any potency, needs to have a relation to God's essence as well, i.e. applied to his essence. And if this is possible, then God's essence has potency, or we make a real distinction between power and knowledge. Sounds more like a statement.
So this question is unintelligible, but the reason I understand it is because it comes from the same Muslim troll that continues to do this. So the answer is that they're equivocating on the term potency. So when they're saying that God's power has potency, in the first sense, they mean God's ability to create anything, and we agree with that. And if you want to call that potency, yes. But we don't believe that potentials exist in them, in God, in the sense of there being nothing actual, right? In the sense of there being something non-actual. So I would say that this is an equivocation fallacy. But the question is unintelligible. The only reason I can understand it is because I have spoken to this pea-brained individual, and I have kind of half made out what they were trying to say. It was a really, really bad fallacy.
Very
Understood.
quickly, Greg Pill, can I say something very quickly? I wanted to keep this. I wanted to speak about, the essence and energies of God with Canadian. I thought, and I'm not trying to be rude in this, but I thought we were going to save the Q&A, like the question answering after the open discussion when we get into Q&A.
Oh, that must have been my misunderstanding. I understood this to be the Q&A portion.
Oh no. So the format is that after cross examinations, we have a 30-minute open discussion, and then afterwards we proceed to Q&A.
Okay, well, let's finish up this Q&A section because there's plenty coming in. So I apologize for that, and then we'll go back to the open discussion section where it will just be you two, and then closing 5-minute closings, and then we can continue the conversation if you'd like.
Yeah, of course. Since we're already on this, let's just keep going.
Okay, Canadian Catholic, do you as a Christian see a need to qualify one's reading of Aristotle, since Aristotle was a non-Christian and formulated his metaphysical views, such as his theory of causes, to defend such?
Yeah, we have to qualify Aristotle. Definitely. Many people are very fascinated with Aristotle to the point that they're going to say that, oh, there's nothing. Everything Aristotle said we are, but only Christians. That's not true. We have to qualify Aristotle, obviously. We have to make sense that Aristotle is simply instrumental. He's useful. He was useful, rather, in a certain sense. That's all, right? We don't want to say that Aristotle just. Aristotle is, we use Aristotle, and it's really nice. Just like we use Plato, we use other philosophers, Christian or non-Christian. That's all. There's no special commitment we need to have to Aristotle.
Okay, very good. Thank you, John. Would you like to respond to that one in particular? There's another one for you.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Speaking of Aristotle, I mean, I think Aristotle gives us a lot of good principles, right, that we can definitely give an orthodox reading to. For example, Saint Maximus the Confessor and Saint John of Damascus. Saint Maximus the Confessor in his beginning of his book 200 Chapters on Theology, or Saint John of Damascus in his book Fount of Knowledge, right? They actually give an orthodox reading to Aristotle, and they use a lot of Aristotelian principles, which actually proves my point exactly, because although the body and soul are composed, this was simply used as an analogy being something that is similar in one way, dissimilar in another way. And obviously we can make this analogy for Christology, but we wouldn't say that the hypostasis, the divine hypostasis of Christ, for example, is composed. And therefore, based on that and the energies in Christ, we can say that God is not composed because there's a real distinction between his essence and his energies. And one other thing I would like to say is that Aristotle's principle in De Anima, right, on the soul, when he speaks about how the soul is fully instantiated in each of the operative bodily expressions, yet transcends the body and mode of existence because the body is material and the soul is immaterial, actually proves my point exactly, that the essence can infinitely transcend the energies to an infinite degree, an infinite number of times, while also fully subsisting in each uncreated energy without contradicting unity nor giving any contradictions. And this is why Saint Athanasius in part 2 of Against the Heathens, he speaks about how the soul moves each of our operative bodily expressions. And obviously Saint Athanasius also affirms that the will of God is transcended by his essence, and will is a faculty of nature, therefore meaning that there's a real distinction in God, i.e. his essence transcending his will. That's even Saint Augustine makes a real distinction on this.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Another question for you, John. Would St. Maximus the Confessor's view on logical categories still apply in the face of modern developments of logics with term representations of propositions and infinitary logics?
I don't really understand. That was a pretty long question. Can you define it? Whoever asked that question.
Sure, and they can clarify further, but I guess those
You can unmute them and they can ask me the question. That's fine. They can go on this. That was a pretty long question, so I didn't really get the full grasp of it.
I'm not so sure that I can unmute somebody, but if somebody would like to unmute parenthesis dot left bracket dash dot slash star dot 2 dot there.
You can just call me Sep. So the question was that St. Maximus the Confessor was certainly aware of the syllogistic logic of Aristotle from, say, Porphyry and other sources, non-Aristotelian sources. But in modern times, there's been a development of, say, even infinitary logics, right? So, where propositions are infinite strings of symbols in length. So, and there's
Okay.
even logics that have they can represent other propositions, whole classes of propositions, and so then predicate on those the properties of those classes of propositions, in effect representing whole logics.
Well, what I
So
would
with
say,
these developments, would Saint Maximus the Confessor's views about logical categories, whatever that is, still hold?
well, I would say, well, this is what I would say first, right? So first we have to understand that logic, right? We have to understand that logic proceeds from metalogical discussion within philosophy, philosophy at its core being wisdom, right? And you know, all wisdom ultimately derives from the uncreated energy of wisdom. Now, what we say about the energies of God is that they are infinite, right? So that's why the church fathers go into much philosophical and theological, because they're not divorced from one another, explication on the energies of God. And when they're defending the energies of God, and this is all affirmed by St. Mark of Ephesus in his syllogistic chapters against the Latins. But here's the thing, St. Maximus wouldn't apply these logical categories, even infinitary logic, to the essence of God, because infinitary logic deals with that which is infinite, right? And obviously we have no problem saying, and obviously we say that the energies are infinite, you know, and we go into much philosophical explication on the essence energy distinction, as I've done multiple times in this debate. But because the essence is beyond infinity, right? This is why St. Maximus says that God transcends his energies, God's essence transcends his energies to an infinite degree, an infinite number of times. And at the last question 63, section 9, right? Because the essence of God is beyond infinity, even infinitary logic, even St. Maximus wouldn't use infinitary logic as applied to the essence of God, because it transcends even infinitary logic, which deals with that which is infinity, but the essence of God is beyond infinity, according to difficulty 5 of St. Maximus.
I would say that you've had a larger mouthful in your answer than in my question. But thank you for your answer.
Thank you. So, next question is for Canadian Catholic. This is kind of two questions in one for several people. The first one is, would you please provide us some Church Fathers quotes for the support of absolute divine simplicity? The second is it accurate to say that for all x, if x has y property, then x is something like f, meaning the statements x has y property and x is something like f are similar?
So I'll address the first question, and then I'll be happy to. I'll ask you to repeat it though. So good places to go, I guess, for divine simplicity and church fathers. Cyril of Alexandria. There is Dialogues on Trinity, book 5. You can check out 237. If you use the De Durand edition, page 290, very good early support for it. You can also check out the books that are. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, good. Thanks, Rocco. The sources for Augustine, I mean, I don't even have to cite Augustine because it's so obvious that Augustine supported divine simplicity. I'm just going to say the word Augustine out there. And I mean, you know, a cursory Google search of divine simplicity is going to bring up Augustine. So the two church fathers I cite is Cyril of Alexandria in whatever I cited, the Dialogues on the Trinity, right? And the second one would be Augustine. I mean, again, I could do a lot more, but I don't see put that in the question. So the second one was what? Is it accurate to say that for all x, if x has property y, then x is something like f, meaning the statement x is y property and x is something like f are the same? I don't understand the question. So for all x, if x has y property, then x is something like f. No, I don't think so. I don't think that would necessarily be true. Something like f. No, not necessarily. Okay, so no, the answer is no. Okay, let's move on.
Question for Canadian Catholic. Aquinas
Very
is
quickly, can I say something?
sure.
Yeah, nothing. I just want to say something on what he said. I regularly read the Church Fathers, right? And I just want to say something on what he said. So concerning Saint Cyril of Alexandria, what Saint Cyril of Alexandria is dealing with on the dialogues on the Trinity, right? He's dealing with those who actually believe that God is composed of essence and energy or at least those arguing this, because they believe that a real distinction would entail composition and then division, right? But this is why Saint Cyril of Alexandria says in Book 8 of Dialogues on the Trinity that God is not composed of nature and energy. But the same Saint Cyril of Alexandria makes a real distinction between nature and energy in Thesaurus 17:18, Thesaurus 9, and Thesaurus 31. Now, concerning Saint Augustine uses the love analogy, and although I agree that there is a Thomistic reading to Saint Augustine, there's also a completely Eastern Orthodox reading to Saint Augustine as well. Saint Augustine's love analogy is actually used in 150 chapters by Saint Gregory Palamas, and Saint Gregory Palamas uses this to affirm energetic eternal manifestation, which is both a hypostatic and energetic reality, which is only possible if you have the nature hypostases and the nature energy distinction that Saint Basil speaks about in letter 38. And what Saint Gregory Palamas says here is that the Holy Spirit, in 150 chapters, it's described as the love that the Father has for the Son, and the Son uses it back towards the Father, and this should be considered as the eternal shining forth of the Spirit's hypostases from the Father, right? The Holy Spirit has his existence in the Father, but exists through the Son, right? Which is only possible if you have the doctrine of energetic manifestation, which is predicate on the essence energy distinction, which is denied at Vatican I. So there is a completely orthodox reading to Saint Augustine to show that he actually did affirm the essence energy distinction, as well as refuted the Filioque, which is actually based on the fact that they don't make a nature person distinction, which leads to modal collapse, which even Aquinas questions in Summa Theologia, question 36, and Sed ex cathedra cantante domino by Eugene V1 in Florence.
Interesting. Thank you. Question for Canadian Catholic. Aquinas' exemplar of divine power is twofold, constituted of active power and passive power, as you know. But this question lies within the virtual distinction Aquinas posits between this twofold conception of divine power. However, I have yet to understand this equivocal distinction. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but if the context of the virtual distinction is precisely the fabric in reality, then on what grounds can Thomists say this virtual distinction is not a real distinction when the context is another real distinction? The way Thomism articulates a virtual distinction seems very similar to Scotus's formal. If you don't mind also, can you explicate how virtual distinctions are different from formal distinctions? I'm happy to repeat any part of that you need.
Yeah, you'll have to you send me the link. Just copy paste it in my DM.
Got it.
Can I say something very quickly, Gorko?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say something. So concerning virtual distinction, because this analogy was brought up earlier, right? About, the evening star and morning star, right? It's both the planet Venus, right? It's both that celestial sphere. And I got into using astronomy to actually prove that there can be real distinctions without entailing division. But concerning the morning star, I mean, you can look at a lunar cycle, right? It's usually categorized with eight cycles, right? That the moon rotates around the earth, right? And although depending on the position of the moon and what we conceptualize of the moon, whether it's a full moon, whether we can't see the moon at all, or whether it's a crescent moon, right? We give these different categorizations, but again, we're all predicating the same exact thing. So when you give analogies to affirm the virtual,
I'm ready to respond to the question. Okay, so that was the question was good, but it was confused because it started very early, took a big angle, so that's what I guess confusing. Okay, so the question is, what distinguishes virtual distinctions that Aquinas sometimes uses from formal distinctions? And this is again a good question. Now, I have to say I'm not very well studied on Scotism, right? So I have to admit that I'm not a Scotist by any stretch of the imagination. One distinction that I think exists is that Scotists believe that in formal distinctions, there's a sense in which these distinctions are drawn towards something or directed towards one thing rather than another thing. So, for example, when Scotus might draw the formal distinction between one thing and the other, one is directed towards love and the other is directed towards some other thing. In virtual distinctions, what Aquinas says is that when we draw conceptual distinctions, they don't merely exist in our mind, right? These distinctions are something that really exist in God. They're not real because they are referring to the same being, referring to the same thing. They're not referring to anything else. There is a distinction between them. So, for example, there is not merely a verbal distinction. So, if you guys really want to touch on this, you have to go and see. Read Aquinas, why these two are not why God's I guess attributes are not synonyms, right? So when we say God's power and God's knowledge, for example, we're not saying that same thing, just using different words. There's a distinction between God's power and God's knowledge, I believe. That's what I used, I guess. So virtual distinctions really just want to identify something within God that can be conceptually distinct, not just in our minds, I guess. Whereas formal distinctions, from what I understand, things that are formally distinct are drawn towards something. So that which is formally distinct from another thing is drawn towards that thing, or somehow can be, I guess, directed. Again, this is from the cursory knowledge I have of Scotism. I have not gotten into it. I completely apologize if I got something wrong.
Very good.
May I finish on what I was saying?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just finishing up on this, right? So when you have the lunar cycle, there's also multiple other minor cycles, but you mainly have 8 cycles in lunarology, right? And you have 8 cycles of the moon, and we base this on conceptualization. When you look up into the sky, sometimes you might see a crescent moon, sometimes you might see a full moon, sometimes you might see half a moon, right? So it really depends. And based on these conceptualizations, we give different names to each cycle, right? But here's the thing, that doesn't do anything because again, we're still speaking about the moon, right? So whether we give it a name based on what we conceptualize of the moon doesn't mean anything as regards to a virtual distinction, because you can literally apply this to anything. For example, I can have a can of Coca-Cola right now and just change the lighting, and based on that changing of lighting, I can predicate another conceptualized name, but that doesn't do anything. Hence why the church fathers say that when we do this would actually lead to God being composed, because we're saying that these energies, which are really distinct from the essence, if we're merely saying that they're just conceptualizations that are all predicating the same thing, then they say that this would lead to God being composed. And I'll give the citations after the debate, but this is found in and I'm just going based off of memory here, but this is by Saint Cyril of Alexandria, Thesaurus 31, Saint Gregory Nazianzus, Oration 2910, Saint Cyril of Alexandria, Thesaurus 9, and Saint John of Damascus on the Orthodox Faith, Book 1, Chapter 9. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I think that exhausts the questions that we've received and are just about at the end of this time period. Anyway, so moving back to the open discussion portion, please feel free, Canadian Catholic or John, to, let's say, since John began the opening statements, will allow Canadian Catholic to begin the open discussion period. This is a 30-minute period where you two are free to discuss these ideas and even related ideas, but I'll just ask for continued civility on both of your parts. Thank you.
Very quickly, Greg Pill, if we're still discussing on something and it exceeds 30 minutes, can we add extra time?
Of course.
Okay.
Oh, actually, that's too much. I can't do like 1 hour. Right. So I'm sorry, but I'll have to be satisfied with 30 minutes.
Okay, sure. So if we're discussing on something and it just kind of stops at 30 minutes, then I'll just go into Orthodox VC because I'm going to be active tonight and I'll just continue there. All right, so you can start.
No worries. Yeah, so I don't think that we got give me a second. So I don't think we got any answer to the incoherences that have been pointed other than to do something. So I mean, I don't know where you want to take this. I mean, I think that
I would simply ask you, what is the essence of, you would agree that the essence of God is the whatness of something, correct?
Yeah. So God is that. God is what He is, so on and so forth.
Okay, God is what He is, right? And I have a question: is God what He is external to the mind?
What do you mean?
Well, how about this, right? So when you say that God is who He is, right? When you're saying that God is love, God is wisdom, right? And those are conceptualizations according to you. So again, I'd have to ask: are these external to the mind, or they're merely conceptual?
So I don't understand what you mean. So God really is love, whether or not we exist. So in that sense, I guess it's external.
Okay, so God really is love, right? So love is really distinct from wisdom, prior to the mind.
Love is really so. That's not fair because when we want to say that God is love, we want to say that God is His love. So we don't want to be pantheists. We don't want to say something like God is just love in general. No, God is His own love.
Well, as Eastern Orthodox, what we would say is that the energy of love, and this is, and I didn't really get a time to define this, right? So it might have sounded like, God forbid, that I was saying that the energies are identical to the essence in strict identification. When I was speaking about the whatness of God's essence, right? You would agree that God is who He is, right? So we have, us Eastern Orthodox, we have no problem saying that God is love, as 1 John 4:8 says, or God is wisdom, power, right? But it just depends on which mode you are saying this in, right? And I didn't really get to explicate on what I was talking about when I was speaking about the whatness of God, as St. Basil defines in letter 38.
Yeah, so I don't actually understand, and I've given up that I can understand because I just don't think that anybody does what it means for God to, for energies to be identical to God, and for His essence to be identical to God, and for God to be both energy and essence, but God not to be, energies of God to not be the essence of God. I've just given up on that because I don't know how that can make any coherent
Well, there's
sense.
different. Well, here's the thing, right? There's different definitions to identification. Identification does not always mean synonymous, right? Identification in mathematics also means bearing similarity, right? And Saint Gregory Palamas, he actually explains this in chapter 34 of 150 chapters. He said, "In wisdom there's goodness, and in goodness there's wisdom, and because the energies indwell one another." And he's quoting the Psalms like Psalm 114 or Psalm 114 or Psalm 145. He's quoting the Psalms to show manifest this, and because the energies indwell one another, insofar as much as that, we can say that the energies are identical to each other, but not in strict identification. And that's why we have no problem saying that the Son is identical to the divine essence, insofar as much as He fully instantiates the divine essence while maintaining a real nature person distinguishment and distinction and difference, as St. Basil does in letter to 125.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand that, but that's fine. I mean,
Okay, so you just don't understand my point. I give you church fathers and I give you a clear explanation. You just say you don't understand. I'm not trying to be like rude here, but I don't know how we can have a discussion when I just give you basic church father terminologies and you just kind of say no one here understands. I'm sure everyone understands.
okay, so I mean, I can only speak for myself. I can say what I suspect of others, but I'm just saying I don't know what sort of logical framework that idea can come to. It's not classical logic. Maybe it's some kind of neoclassical logic. I don't know. It's not any kind of a logical sphere I'm familiar with under which it works. But again, it's fine. It could be because I'm dumb, and that's why I don't understand. I always have that possibility open, so that's fine. So
Okay, sure. So I'll say this. How about this? I'll say this, right? So I'll explicate more because you were mentioning Aristotle and you're quoting from De Anima, which by the way, if you take many principles from De Anima and give it an orthodox reading as Saint Maximus does in 200 chapters on theology, then it actually proves many of my points here. But when I was mentioning you being composed of the body and soul, right? I was using that as an analogy for Christology, right? Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and this is mentioned in Han Van's Loon book called The Diaphysitic Christology of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, I believe chapter 8. It's page 530. I just don't know the specific chapter, but he speaks about how Saint Cyril of Alexandria uses the Mia Physis formula, and the Mia Physis formula was to talk about that Christ is one composite hypostasis in theory only, that He is one real divine hypostasis, but the human nature in theory, and only in theory, has a human hypostasis. Therefore, insofar as much as theoria, we can say that Christ is one composed hypostasis, but Saint Cyril of Alexandria explicates and explains this in page 76, 77, and 85 of his book on the unity of Christ, and he speaks about how this is merely in theoria, and that Christ is one real divine hypostasis, therefore he's not composed, he's not a composite hypostasis, as the Miaphysites try to say.
I wasn't listening. Were you saying something?
Okay. All right. So, okay, I guess I'll go into other arguments. I'm sure everyone else heard me. If you don't want to respond, then that's up to you. Okay, how about this? So I talked about how in De Anima, right? Actually, I'll speak on the whatness of God, right? So when we speak of the whatness of God, right, we're talking about the nature or essence of God, because nature and essence are used interchangeably. But at the same time, and we see this distinguishment in Saint Emperor Justinian's letter to the Alexandrians against the Monophysites, and it's called Against the Monophysites, and Saint Emperor Justinian the Great, when he's speaking about Dioscorus's letter from Gangros to Alexandria, this is what he says, quote, that what blasphemy could be harder to bear than that which of Dioscorus, in saying that the blood of Christ, referring to the human properties of Christ, are of the same essence as divine nature, right? So this shows a clear distinguishment between how nature and essence are used in certain contextualizations. Nature, by definition, means the properties, characteristics, or attributes of something, and what God is, and we can say this in a sense that God is his attributes, God is his properties, and God is his characteristics, not in strict identification, and not to say that the essence of God forbid, is a composite of these energies. Rather, it is God as he is in his superessential transcendency and interbeing, and then what flows out from the essence of God is these multiplicity of uncreated energies, as Saint Simeon, the New Theologian, says, quoting Exodus chapter 33, verse 20 to 22, about the face of God and his back, and he speaks about how there's multiple rays proceeding from the face of God. So I just wanted to clarify on that.
I see.
Okay. So I didn't really get to finish on this. So again, what are you defining as a real distinction? Since we can kind of like ask each other questions now and not it be so strict, what do you define as a real distinction?
A real distinction is a distinction which has some grounding in those things which are distinct.
Okay, so how about this, right? So when the Lord Jesus Christ in John chapter 17 verse 5, he says, "Father, glorify me with the glory that I had with you before the foundations of the earth were set, before creation," right? Do you think that the Lord Jesus Christ is merely speaking of a conceptualization that is really identical to the essence and really identical to love and glory and grace, etc.?
No, I don't think that Jesus is talking about any metaphysical principles. It's very human language to refer to Jesus' glory.
Well, no, this is what's divinely revealed. In fact, we see this in Isaiah 42 verse 8, where God says that I share my glory with nobody, right? So we see that the glory that the Lord Jesus Christ is speaking about is the eternal glory that Saint Maximus speaks about, that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit eternally glorify each other in tripersonal communion, which, by the way, actually gets into my doctrine that I was going to speak on about energetic manifestation and eternal manifestation, which just kind of refutes your Thomistic reading of Saint Augustine, who is the only person you really appeal to, because I showed that Saint Cyril of Alexandria believed in a real distinction between the energies in Christ and the natures in Christ, and he also believed in an essence energy distinction in his Thesaurus.
I mean, is there a question anywhere here?
We haven't gotten to Q&A, we're having a discussion. This isn't cross-examination or Q&A, so we have a discussion.
What am I supposed to respond to?
Oh, you can respond to whatever you like. You can just like dodge everything I'm saying and just make a completely irrelevant point. It's an open discussion.
So, I mean, I have no understanding of what you're talking about, simply because I don't think anything you're saying makes any sense. I don't think you have any respect for either logical categories or metaphysical categories. I think you're just abusing language, because anytime I try to fit it in any kind of logic or a metaphysical framework, whether that be classical logic, neoclassical logic, analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, or Thomistic or Aristotelian philosophy, it just doesn't fit. So I've come to the conclusion that this is gibberish. It doesn't have any kind of redeeming value, and it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. There is no way to make sense of it. So I've given up on trying to rationally and coherently understand, because my conviction is that this isn't rational, that there isn't nothing rational in here, not even something resembling rationality. This is just basic gibberish made up for the sake of gibberish. I don't think there's a way to make sense of it. I don't think there's a way to fit it in any kind of a logical category that I'm aware of. So I don't know what to discuss. I don't know what there is to discuss. The queries I've had, I mean, show that I'm not aware of any logical system under which any of this makes any sense. So I have nothing to say that would be informative, because either I am not familiar with the logical or metaphysical framework being used for this, which is a possibility, I can see that, or it's just pure gibberish that has no meaning whatsoever to anyone. So I don't know. You
Okay,
maybe
so you don't, okay, great. So you don't know. So you're essentially conceding. You're essentially conceding, but I'll read out this one quote, right? Because you want to argue against, because here's the thing, right? I've read the Summa Contras. I've read, at least an abridged version of the Summa Theologia, right? I've read almost all of the church fathers concerning Christology and triadology. So concerning the subject, I know the terminologies of the church fathers or the theologians that you accept, right? So that's why there is no confusion with me. But I guess I'll read out this quote because if you had actually read anything on the essence energy distinction, then you would know this because in page 121 of one of the most popular books on the essence energy distinction in Holy Hesychasm, which has to do with, theosis and participating in coming to communion with God as he is in his, God himself in his energies, right? This is what page 121 says. It says that to the philosophical objection that he, St. Gregory Palamas, was introducing a second and lower God besides the unique Godhead, Palamas replied over and over again that no multiplicity of divine manifestations could affect the unity of God, for God is beyond the categories, the logical categories of whole and parts, and while in his essence will always remain unknowable, he reveals himself wholly in each energy. And Tornstein Tollefson, he actually comments on this in chapter 4, pages 148 to 149 of his book, The Christocentric Cosmology of St. Maximus the Confessor, and says this is a clear manifestation of the real distinction. But wait, who is Saint John? Who is Saint Gregory Palamas and Father John Meindorf citing here? They're citing Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, who speaks about how there's a multiplicity within God, right? And how how we know God is by the multiplicity of his processions of his divine activities coming down to us. And on the Divine Names chapter 9, that there's a real distinction, that there are real distinctions in God without contradicting God's unity. For there's distinction in unity and unity in distinction. And chapter 2 of On the Divine Names, and how there's a multiplicity within God concerning his divine names, which are the energies of God, as defined in chapter 3 of On the Divine Names. And this is affirmed even using Neoplatonic language in the Mystical Theology, chapter 5 of St. Dionysius the Areopagite. So according to everything I've just cited right now, St. Dionysius the Areopagite in the 1st century, a direct disciple of St. Paul the Apostle, Acts chapter 17, verse 34, taught the real distinction between essence and energies. And your claim earlier in general chat was that the essence energy distinction was created in the 14th century. I've just proven you wrong, and I guess you have no response. So I guess we'll get into closing statements.
Okay. Any other responses from Canadian Catholic during this period? Open discussion before we move on.
no, I have nothing to respond to. I mean, I laid out my case. I don't think anything has changed.
Understood. So, Canadian Catholic, would you like to begin the closing statement period with your 5-minute closing?
Yeah. So my view is that I've explicated a doctrine as far as I could understand what essence energy thinks is, and I've given a charitable reading to it. I was explained. I took some notes to explain it, and ultimately, from what I understand, is that it doesn't make any coherent sense. There is no logical category in which it fits. There is no metaphysical category in which it fits, and it contradicts everything we know. From what I understand, it cannot refer to anything that exists or can exist because it is contradictory, right? It's logically contradictory. It's metaphysically contradictory. There's nothing in it that could be redeemed. I got no response to this objection. All I got was what I think is gibberish. Now, again, I understand that this isn't the most charitable objection. I'm just saying this is how I see it. Now, I'm open again to there being, for example, a philosophical system, so on and so forth, that I'm not familiar with. Okay, I'm open to that. But I'm skeptical because I've engaged with many people on this, and I used to think that this made sense. From what I understand now, is that it doesn't. It's just a waste of time. I was reluctant to agree to this debate. I have because I was offered something, and I mean, it was largely a waste of my time. Though I mean, maybe not so much if I get what I was promised, but ultimately it turned out to be a waste of time because I don't think that this is a real debate. The essence energy distinction is not some debate that exists in academia, right? Not in any serious academic philosophical thing. I mean, I'm a student of medieval philosophy, and these things just don't come up, unfortunately, and they don't come up because, from what I understand, they either are incoherent, based on shoddy history, either this is another conjecture, or simply just make absolutely no sense. And I suspect that's one of those. So I'm happy to debate nonsensical stuff because I've got some time, I guess, and I'm not particularly someone who's uptight or high maintenance and somebody who can't go out of his way. But from what I understand, this is not a serious debate to have because we're not talking about something that could exist or does exist. We're talking about something that is incoherent. And simply biting the bullet and saying, okay, it's incoherent, but we're going to say a bunch of gibberish under which it's possibly coherent, it just doesn't make any sense. So, like, I mean, I've given up on the project of understanding this because my view is that it's not something that can be made sense of. Now, if there is a now, I'm not dismissing the Eastern Orthodox view because it very well could be that the Eastern Orthodox view is different and there's multiple, and this is just one understanding. I don't know. Like, as I'm saying, I'm open to there being some other interpretation of essence energy distinction that makes sense, maybe some other language in which it makes sense. So I wouldn't go as far as say that, Eastern Orthodoxy fails because I don't know that much. I mean, again, I'm not going to make those grand claims. All I'm going to say is that the current iteration of the essence energy distinction is not a coherent doctrine. And while I'm not against people holding to it, I don't think that anybody should hold to a doctrine that is demonstrably incoherent. So I guess that concludes my opening statement.
All right. So I guess my closing statement would be is that here's the thing, right? And I think this is very disingenuous, but I'm not going to focus on like just saying like, oh, incoherent this and incoherent that, because that's not really an argument. But what I will say is that addressing what Canadian Catholic said, I have answered all of his questions, right? I've given him church father quotes. I even got into metalogical discussion, and I gave him all the citations and all the quotations, and I gave him basic books on the subject and the philosophical explications they've given, right? And all he's responded with, oh, that's incoherent. We can't talk about this because it doesn't exist. Well, if you truly think that this is incoherent, then why are you talking about it in the first place? You clearly do have your objections against this doctrine, right? And you clearly, and based on these objections, you do instantiate behind these doctrines that, behind your objections that, I believe that this is incoherent. But I've answered all of your questions. I've given church father citations, and I will further give citations in the debate citation chat after this debate is over. But what I will say is that concerning the transcendency, you yourself mentioned the enema by Aristotle. I mentioned the principle that Aristotle gives that your soul transcends your body, right? But it's not reducible because transcendency does not mean that you're reducible to one thing or another. Your soul transcends your body being immaterial because transcendency refers to the mode in which you exist, and yet your soul is fully instantiated and fully subsists in each of your operative bodily expressions. So I went to the citations that you went to. I went to St. Augustine. I went to Aristotle, and they said like, oh, I just don't know these categorizations, it's incoherent. I went to their own categorizations, and I showed that Aristotle, by his own principles, he actually is affirming what I'm saying, because I believe that in God there's a real distinction between his essence and his uncreated energies. The essence fully subsists in that which proceeds from it, i.e. the energies that are really distinct from the essence, because the essence infinitely transcends the energies to an infinite degree, an infinite number of time, as said by St. Maximus the Confessor in the Ambigua, not in the Ambigua, and Athanasium 63, and by St. Gregory Palamas in the Triads 3, page 96, right? And I used Aristotle's principle, which you yourself appeal to affirm this, concerning whether the essence energy distinction entails division. No, it does not entail division, because division means the splitting up of something into parts. In order to even get into division, you would first have to presuppose that something is composite, but composition is only applicable to that which is substance. And as I've demonstrated from Osberg's book on real essentialism, page 156 to 157, called Real Essentialism, energies, i.e. the properties of God, which we call activities, energies, right? They are not parts because they are not substances. And this is why St. Cyril of Alexandria actually turns this around on people who argue the same thing as you, who believe in absolute, quote, divine simplicity. And St. Cyril of Alexandria says that if what we say is of God is identical to his nature, i.e. his essence, then God for us would be composed of many essences. And this is why Maximus of Jerusalem in the 2nd century says that two uncreated substances cannot exist together, because that would entail composition, because substance is interchangeable of essence, as we see in chapter 1 of letter 38 of St. Basil. Yet, we don't say that the energies are substances. I've proven this from the basic tenets of real essentialism. Therefore, we cannot apply this category to the energies, saying that they're parts, and therefore we can say that there's a multiplicity in God. There are clear distinctions and real distinctions in God, as St. Dionysius says in chapter 1, 2, 3, 9, and 12, and 13 on the divine names, without contradicting the unity of God. And I'll concede the rest of my time.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for your time and sharing your knowledge with us here tonight. And thank you also for the crowds and everybody who participated in the Q&A. I hope this was very enlightening. This will be recorded and uploaded. This is the Politics and Religion Discord channel. Please feel free to come check us out on Discord and hang out. So thus concludes the debate. Feel free to hang out. I think John will be down in the Orthodox chat. I will be in the Protestant chat, and all the other chats, of course, as always, are open. So thank you all for your time.
Very quickly, just so that I can, please some people in here, go to general chat. I'm posting the tongue sticking out the face emojis. Let's see what else is on the bingo. First of all, God forbid, I've never once said that His Eminence Patriarch Kirill is an apostate. I've said that Patriarch Bartholomew is an apostate. So here you can X that out on your bingo. Hey, brother Blackout. Yeah, the Papist Church is hated by God Almighty, and I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and I will never betray my faith. And Eastern Orthodoxy is the only true religion, as I've demonstrated here, and that essence energy distinction is dogmatic if you look at the Sixth Ecumenical Council.
Okay,